I've been listening to stories on this channel for years, mostly to help me sleep. It's ironic, I guess, considering what I do for a living. I work as a field audio engineer. Basically, if a movie needs the sound of a bustling Tokyo street or a video game needs the specific crunch of snow under boots in the Alps, I'm the guy who goes out and captures it. I'm used to weird places. I'm used to isolation. I've spent weeks alone in the Mojave Desert and days camping in abandoned industrial parks without ever feeling truly afraid. But what happened to me last October in the Cascade foothills broke me. I don't just mean it scared me, I mean it fundamentally changed the way I look at the world. To this day, I can't wear noise-canceling headphones. I can't stand not being able to hear the room I'm sitting in. It started with a contract from a wellness tech company. They wanted a library of ultra-immersive nature sounds for a new meditation app. They were specific about what they wanted: zero human noise pollution. No distant airplanes, no highway hum, no power lines. They wanted pre-industrial silence. The pay was obscene, enough to cover my rent for 6 months, so I took it immediately. I found a listing for a property that seemed perfect. It was a retrofitted ranger cabin, built back in the 50s, located at the end of a 10-mile logging road that hadn't seen active duty in decades. The owner, a guy I only spoke to via email, warned me that there was absolutely no cell service and no grid power. The cabin ran on a backup generator and a large propane tank. It was exactly what I needed. I arrived around 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. The drive up was brutal. My SUV barely handled the washed-out gravel track, and by the time the trees opened up to reveal the cabin, my nerves were already a little fried from the focus required just to keep the car on the road. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by a wall of pines that seemed unnaturally tall. It was sturdy, built from dark treated logs, with a wide porch and windows that looked like dark eyes staring back at me. When I killed the engine, the silence hit me like a physical weight. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears. I spent the first few hours unpacking. I had a lot of gear: boom mics, windjammers, a few shotgun microphones for long-range pickup, and my prized possession, a binaural dummy head. If you've never seen one, it's creepy looking. It's a mannequin head with high-fidelity microphones inside the realistic silicone ears. It captures audio in 3D exactly how a human hears it. When you listen to the playback, it sounds like you're actually there. By 5 p.m., the sun was dipping behind the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the clearing. I decided to do a test run before losing the light. I set up the dummy head on a tripod about 50 yards into the tree line, facing away from the cabin. I ran the XLR cables back through the grass, up the porch stairs, and into my digital recorder, which sat on a small wooden table outside. I put on my headset, professional grade, completely isolating, and hit record. The world rushed in. Through the headphones, the silence was full of life. I could hear the dry rattle of pine needles brushing against each other in the breeze, the snap of a twig somewhere far off, the chattering of a squirrel that sounded like it was sitting on my shoulder. The fidelity was perfect. I closed my eyes, just letting the amplified sounds of the forest wash over me, checking my levels. The meter on my recorder was bouncing gently in the green. Perfect baseline. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, eyes closed, just listening. The sun was almost gone now. The air was getting colder. Then the levels spiked. It was a sharp jump, pushing the meter into the red for a split second. I flinched, adjusting the gain, thinking maybe a bird had landed on the dummy head. I listened closely. Scritch? Scritch? It sounded like fabric rubbing against bark. It was coming from the left channel, the left ear of the dummy head. I opened my eyes and looked out toward the tree line. The dummy head was just a silhouette now, a dark shape standing amongst the trees. I couldn't see anything around it. I looked back at the recorder. The levels were normalizing, but then they spiked again. Crunch. Distinct. Heavy. That was a footstep. It wasn't a deer. A deer has a 4-point cadence. This was a 2-step rhythm. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Someone was walking. "Hello?" I called out, pulling one ear cup off. My voice sounded flat and small in the clearing.
Silence. Just the wind. I put the ear cup back on. Through the microphone, the sound was different. The footsteps had stopped, but now there was something else. A low, rhythmic sound. It was wet. Breathing. Someone was standing right next to the microphone. The sound was so close it felt like hot breath on my own neck. I ripped the headphones off and stood up, shining my flashlight toward the tripod. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the pale silicone face of the dummy head. There was nobody there. The clearing was empty. I stood on the porch, my heart hammering against my ribs, swinging the light back and forth. I was alone. I had to be alone. I convinced myself it was a badger, or maybe a curious bear that had scurried off when I yelled. Animals sound weird through amplified audio. That's what I told myself. But then I looked at the recorder, which was still running. The levels weren't flat. The little green bars were dancing rhythmically, pulsing up and down in a steady beat. Something was still standing right next to the microphone, and even though I couldn't see it with my eyes, the machine was telling me it was there. For a solid 10 seconds, I just stared at the little LCD screen on the recorder, watching those green bars dance. My brain was trying to force a logical explanation into a situation that defied one. Radio interference, I thought. Maybe I'm picking up a ham radio signal bounced from 3 towns over. It happens. Sometimes cables act as antennas if they aren't shielded properly. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Interference sounds like static, buzzing, or garbled voices. It doesn't sound like wet, heavy lungs pushing air in and out. I couldn't leave the equipment out there. The dummy head alone cost nearly $2,000. I grabbed the heavy maglite from the kitchen counter, and with my other hand, I unclasped the hunting knife I'd brought for peace of mind. It felt ridiculous and heavy in my hand, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins made my grip like iron. I kicked the front door open and stormed out, swinging the flashlight beam aggressively. "Hey, I called the cops," I shouted. A stupid bluff. My phone had 0 bars, and the nearest deputy was probably 40 miles away eating a donut. The forest swallowed my voice. There was no movement, no crashing brush, just the swaying of the pines. I sprinted the 50 yards to the tree line, grabbed the tripod by the neck, and hauled the whole rig back to the cabin, trailing the XLR cables behind me like a dead snake. I didn't stop until I was inside with the deadbolt thrown and the heavy wooden shutters on the windows latched tight. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, my hands shaking enough to spill some on the table, and sat down in front of my laptop. I needed to see the waveform. Ears can play tricks on you. Apophenia, the tendency to perceive connections or meaning between unrelated things, but data doesn't lie. I transferred the SD card file to my computer and opened it in my editing software. The waveform appeared as a visual jagged line on the screen. I put my headphones back on, though I really didn't want to. I skipped ahead to the timestamp where the event happened. There it was. Visually, it was a thick, chaotic blob on the timeline amidst the thin line of silence. I zoomed in. The transient spikes were rhythmic. I isolated the frequency range, cutting out the wind and the low-end rumble of the distant generator. It was undeniable. It was the sound of a large mammal breathing directly into the microphone capsule. But as I scrubbed through the audio, playing it back slowly, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up. At the exact moment I had yelled "hello" in part 1, the breathing stopped. It didn't just fade out, it cut, abruptly. It was a reaction. Whatever was standing there had heard me yell from the porch, held its breath, and listened. Then, when I didn't come out immediately, the breathing resumed, slightly faster, slightly more agitated. And then, the end of the clip, the moment I had turned on my flashlight. Click. On the recording, clear as day, there was a wet, sharp sound right before the audio cut out when I ripped the headphones off. It sounded like a tongue clicking against the roof of a mouth. Not a random animal noise. It was deliberate, mocking. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the main room with the lights on, knife on the table, listening to the cabin settle. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. By morning, the sun broke through the gray cloud cover, and the terror of the night before began to feel distant, almost silly. Daylight has a way of making you feel stupid for being afraid. I went outside with a cup of coffee and inspected the area where the tripod had stood. The ground was covered in a thick layer of pine needles and soft, damp earth. If a person had been standing there, there should be boot prints. If it was a bear, there should be pug marks. I got down on my hands and knees. The 3 holes from the tripod legs were clearly visible, but around them, nothing. The pine needles were undisturbed. I felt a wave of relief. It was a glitch, I told myself. Or maybe an owl flew down, landed on the dummy head, and the breathing sound was just the wind rushing over its wings. It was a stretch, but I forced myself to believe it. I had a job to do, and I wasn't going to let a spooky coincidence cost me this paycheck. I spent the day scouting locations further away from the cabin, trying to keep busy. I hiked about a mile north near a small rocky ravine that had amazing natural reverb. I set up a different rig there, a pair of shotgun mics in a blimp windshield, and left them to record ambient wind sounds for a few hours while I hiked back to the cabin for lunch. When I returned to the ravine around 3 p.m. to retrieve the gear, everything looked fine. The mics were still standing, the recorder was still safely inside its waterproof case. But as I coiled the cables, I noticed something on the ground. Right between the legs of the tripod, resting perfectly in the center, was a dead bird, a robin. It hadn't died of natural causes. Its head had been neatly, surgically twisted backwards, facing the wrong way. I stared at it, the silence of the woods suddenly pressing in on me again. It felt like a message, a warning, or a gift. I packed up the gear in record time, constantly looking over my shoulder. The walk back to the cabin felt twice as long. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every rustle sounded like a step. That evening, I decided I wasn't going out. I was going to record from the safety of the cabin. I set up the binaural dummy head on the porch railing facing out towards the darkness and ran the cables under the doorframe into the living room. I sat on the couch, laptop open, monitoring the feed live. I wanted to catch it. If there was a prankster out here or a weirdo living off the grid, I was going to get evidence. Night fell heavy and fast. By 9 p.m., it was pitch black. I watched the levels on my screen. Green, steady, just the wind. 9:15, 9:30. I was starting to doze off, the rhythmic white noise of the forest lulling me. Then, through the headphones, I heard it. Crunch. My eyes snapped open. It was loud. It wasn't at the tree line this time. It was on the gravel driveway, maybe 20 feet from the porch. Crunch. 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 Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They were walking towards the cabin. I held my breath, my hand hovering over the mouse. The footsteps got closer. They reached the bottom of the wooden stairs leading up to the porch. Creak. The first step took the weight. Creak. The second step. I was paralyzed. I was sitting 10 feet away from the door, and through my headphones I could hear someone walking up the stairs to the other side of that wood. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. The dummy head was right there. Whoever it was standing right next to it. I waited for the breathing. I waited for the tongue click. Instead, a voice, raspy, dry, and terrifyingly human, whispered directly into the left ear of the dummy head. It felt like the speaker was inside my brain. I can see you through the window. My blood turned to ice. That sentence, I can see you through the window, didn't just scare me, it violated the sanctity of the one place I felt safe. I didn't scream. I didn't run. The lizard brain took over, the part of evolution designed for pure survival. I instinctively dropped to the floor, scrambling on my hands and knees to get below the line of sight of the window. I ripped the headphones off and threw them onto the rug, my breathing ragged and shallow. From my position on the floor, I looked up at the window. The glass was a black mirror reflecting the interior of the cabin, the warm glow of the lamp, the edge of the table, and the empty space where I had just been sitting. I couldn't see out, but whoever was on that porch could see in perfectly. I crawled toward the light switch and slapped it down, plunging the room into darkness. Now the tables were turned. If they were out there, they couldn't see me anymore, but I couldn't see them either. I lay there in the dark for what felt like an hour, clutching that hunting knife so hard my knuckles ached. I listened with my naked ears this time. I heard the wind rising, the groan of the cabin settling, but no more footsteps, no more whispers. Eventually, the adrenaline began to curdle into a sick, heavy dread. I knew I couldn't stay on the floor all night. I needed to secure the perimeter. I crept to the front door, checking the deadbolt. It was engaged. I checked the back door. Locked. I dragged the heavy oak dining table across the room and shoved it against the front door. It wasn't much, but it would make noise if someone tried to force their way in. I didn't sleep in the bedroom. The bedroom had a window facing the back woods. Instead, I sat in the hallway, the most interior point of the house, with my back against the wall and the knife in my lap. I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion around 4 a.m. I woke up to gray light filtering through the dust motes in the air. The silence of the morning felt deceptive. I stood up, my body stiff and aching, and walked to the front window. I peeked through the blinds. The porch was empty. The binaural dummy head was still sitting on the railing where I had left it, staring out into the forest like a sentinel that had failed its job. I didn't care about the money anymore. I didn't care about the contract. I was leaving. I packed my essentials in 5 minutes. Laptop, hard drives, wallet, keys. I left the expensive microphones, the stands, the cables. I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to cell service in civilization. I unlocked the front door and pushed the table aside. I took a deep breath and stepped out onto the porch, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the woodpile. Nothing. Just the cold morning mist and the smell of damp pine. I grabbed the dummy head off the railing, not because I wanted it, but because I didn't want to leave anything behind that looked like a human face, and threw it in the back seat of my SUV. I jumped into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Safe. I was in a 2-ton metal box. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. Click. Not a chug, not a whine, just a dead, hollow click. I tried again. Click. No, 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 I whispered. I looked at the dashboard. No lights, no radio. The car was completely dead. I popped the hood latch and stepped out, the anxiety spiking back up into red alert levels. I walked around to the front of the car and lifted the hood. I stared at the engine block, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The battery wasn't just dead, it was destroyed. Someone had taken a heavy, blunt object, maybe a rock or a hammer, and smashed the battery terminals. Acid had leaked out, corroding the metal tray. But it wasn't just the battery. The spark plug wires had been severed, sliced clean through with something sharp. This wasn't wear and tear. This wasn't a rat chewing on wires. This was sabotage. I stood there, gripping the edge of the hood, and the realization washed over me like cold water. The person who had whispered to me last night hadn't just been trying to scare me. They were keeping me here. I slammed the hood down and spun around, scanning the tree line. "What do you want? I'm leaving! Just let me leave!" The forest absorbed my shout. No birds flew. No squirrels chattered. It was that dead room silence again. I looked back at the cabin. It was my only shelter, but it felt like a trap. I couldn't walk out. It was 10 miles to the nearest paved road, and who knows where he was waiting in those 10 miles. I needed to go back inside. I needed to figure out a plan. I walked back up the porch steps, defeated. As I reached for the door handle, something caught my eye. I looked down at the spot where the dummy head had been sitting on the railing all night. There, carved into the wood of the railing, was a fresh mark. It was deep, whittled with a sharp knife. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a threat. It was a tally mark. 4 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal one. 5. I looked at the door of the cabin, then back at the tally mark. I had been here for 4 nights. This was the morning of the 5th day. He wasn't just watching me. He was counting down.
I backed into the cabin and slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt with a force that shook the frame. My hands were trembling so badly I dropped the keys to the SUV, useless keys now, onto the floor. They skittered across the hardwood, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent house. I was trapped. It was a simple, brutal fact. I was 10 miles from help, my vehicle was dead, and there was someone outside who had actively sabotaged my escape. The tally marks burned in my mind. 5. Today was day 5. Did that mean today was the end? Or was it just a record of how long he'd been toying with me? I needed a weapon. The hunting knife was sharp, but it required me to be within arm's reach of this maniac, and that was the last place I wanted to be. I scanned the living room. Above the stone fireplace, there was no antique rifle, no convenient shotgun, just a set of cast-iron pokers and a heavy wood-splitting hatchet resting on the hearth. I grabbed the hatchet. The handle was smooth, worn hickory. It felt solid, better than the knife. I spent the next hour turning the cabin into a fortress. I dragged the heavy oak dining table back against the front door. I took the cushions off the couch and jammed them into the window frames blocking the view. If he couldn't see me, he couldn't time his movements. But the silence was the worst part. I was an audio engineer. I relied on sound to understand my environment. Inside the sealed cabin, I was deaf to the outside world. If he was walking on the gravel, if he was climbing the porch, I wouldn't hear it until he was breaking through the door. I needed ears on the outside. I grabbed my secondary recorder and 2 shotgun microphones, long directional mics designed to pick up dialogue from 50 feet away. I cracked the kitchen window open just an inch, fed the cables through, and duct taped the gap shut. I positioned the mics pointing in opposite directions, one toward the driveway, one toward the back of the house. I plugged them into the mixer on the kitchen table, put on my headphones, and cranked the gain. The forest came back to me. The wind was picking up, a low, mournful howl through the pines. I could hear the rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of the propane generator shed out back. I sat there for hours, listening, monitoring. Every rustle of a leaf made me grip the hatchet tighter. Around 2 p.m., the wind died down for a moment. In the sudden lull, I heard a sound on the back channel. Scrape. It was close. Very close. It sounded like wood dragging on dirt. I froze. Was he at the back door? I listened harder. Rustle. Zip. The sound of a zipper? It wasn't coming from the back door. The acoustic perspective was lower. It sounded muffled, bass-heavy. It sounded like it was coming from underneath something. The cabin was built on a raised foundation with a crawl space underneath, skirted by wooden lattice. I took the headphones off, my heart rate spiking. He wasn't in the woods. He wasn't watching from the tree line. He was under the house. I grabbed the hatchet and the heavy mag light. I knew I shouldn't go outside, but I couldn't sit there knowing he might be right beneath my feet, potentially finding a way to pry up the floorboards. I had to know. I went to the side door, the one leading to the small utility porch. I unlocked it quietly, the click of the tumbler sounding deafening to my own ears. I stepped out, the cold air hitting my sweat-dampened face. I crept down the stairs, moving toward the side of the structure where the wooden lattice skirting was. I held the hatchet raised, ready to swing. I reached the corner of the structure. The wooden lattice panel here looked loose. The nails had been pried out, and it was leaning slightly against the frame, held in place by friction. I took a deep breath, kicked the panel in, and shone the flashlight into the darkness of the crawl space. The beam cut through the dust and cobwebs. It wasn't just a crawl space. It was a living area. Directly under the floorboards of the living room, right beneath where I had been sitting for the last 4 nights, was a sleeping bag. It was filthy, stained with mud and grease. Around it lay a scatter of trash, empty cans of beans, candy wrappers, and water bottles. But it was what was taped to the underside of the floorboards that made me gag. Polaroids. Dozens of them. I leaned in, squinting against the gloom. The photos were of me. Me unpacking the car on day 1. Me setting up the tripod. Me sleeping on the couch through the window. Me drinking coffee on the porch. They were taken from close range. He hadn't been using a telephoto lens from the woods. He had been standing right next to me, just out of my peripheral vision, or watching me from inches away while I slept. And in the center of the collection, taped directly above the sleeping bag, was a map of the cabin. Red marker lines were drawn all over it. They weren't routes of entry. They were acoustic diagrams. He knew the blind spots. The squeaky floorboard in the hall was circled in red. The loose step on the porch was circled. He knew exactly where to walk so I wouldn't hear him. He wasn't just a stalker. He was hunting me using the same logic I used to record sound. He knew the noise floor of the house better than I did.
I was staring at the map, paralyzed by the sheer premeditation of it, when I heard a sound that stopped my heart. From inside the cabin, directly above my head, came the heavy, unmistakable thud of a boot hitting the floorboards. I wasn't the only one who had moved. While I was out here investigating his nest, he had gone inside.
The sound of that boot hitting the floorboards above my head didn't just frighten me, it rewired my understanding of the last 4 days. I wasn't the hunter. I wasn't even the observer. I was the rat, and he had just stepped into the cage I'd built for myself. I scrambled backward, crab walking out of the crawl space, ignoring the sharp rocks digging into my palms and the spider webs clinging to my face. I needed to get out from under the house before he found the trapdoor or simply decided to shoot through the floor. I rolled out onto the wet grass by the utility porch, gasping for air, clutching the hatchet so hard my hand was cramping. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted away from the cabin, putting about 30 yards between me and the structure before I spun around, chest heaving. The cabin stood silent and imposing against the gray afternoon sky. The front door was closed. The windows were still blocked by the cushions I had stuffed into them. To an outsider, it looked abandoned, but I knew better. I watched the front door, waiting for it to burst open. I waited for him to come charging out with a knife or a gun. But he didn't come out. Instead, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. Click-clack. The distinct, heavy sound of the deadbolt sliding home. He wasn't coming out to get me. He was locking himself in. I stood there, shivering in the damp air, trying to calculate my odds. He was inside with my food, my car keys, my warm clothes, and, most terrifyingly, my equipment. I was outside with a hatchet, a flashlight, and the clothes on my back. The temperature was already dropping. It would be freezing by nightfall. I circled the perimeter, staying low, moving from the cover of one pine tree to the next. I needed to see him. I needed to know what I was dealing with. I crept around to the kitchen side of the cabin. The kitchen window was the only one I hadn't blocked completely because of the microphone cables running through the crack. I positioned myself behind the trunk of a massive Douglas fir, about 40 feet away, and peered at the window. The slit was narrow, but I could see a slice of the kitchen interior. A figure moved past the gap. He was tall, lanky. He wore dirty gray coveralls that hung loosely on his frame, like he had shrunk inside them. I couldn't see his face clearly, just a blur of pale skin and dark matted hair. He stopped at the kitchen table. I watched as he picked up something. It was my headphones, the Sony MDR-7506s. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had left the mixer running. I had left the gain cranked high on the 2 shotgun mics that were currently taped to the windowsill, one pointing at the driveway and one pointing right at me in the backyard. I watched, helpless, as he put the headphones on. He adjusted the ear cups, settling them over his ears. Then he reached down to the mixer and slowly turned a knob. He was boosting the signal. I froze. I stopped breathing. I knew the specs of those microphones. They were Sennheiser MKH-416s, industry standard, high sensitivity, low self-noise. With the gain cranked up, they could pick up the sound of a zipper falling from 50 feet away. He wasn't looking out the window. He didn't need to. He stood there with his eyes closed, head tilted slightly, listening. He was using my own gear to hunt me. I was standing on a bed of dry pine needles. If I shifted my weight, if I took a step, the sound would be amplified 10 times over in his ears. He would know exactly where I was. He had the acoustic map. He knew the blind spots inside the house, and now he was mapping the outside. His head snapped to the left, toward the driveway. A squirrel had just scurried across the gravel. He tracked it with his head, precise, robotic. Then he relaxed. He was calibrating. I needed to move. I couldn't stay here. If he knew where I was, he could come out the back door with a weapon before I could react. But I couldn't move without making noise. I looked down at my feet. I was wearing heavy hiking boots. Great for terrain, terrible for stealth.
Slowly, agonizingly, I bent down. I kept my eyes on the figure in the window. He was still listening, swaying slightly, enjoying the power trip. I untied my left boot. I slipped it off. I set it down on a patch of moss. Silence. I untied the right boot. I slipped it off. Now I was in my thick wool socks. It wasn't perfect, but it cut the decibels down significantly. I took a step backward. Inside the kitchen, the figure didn't move. I took another step. Still nothing. I began to retreat, heel to toe, keeping the tree between me and the window. I made it about 10 yards back when the wind suddenly shifted. A gust blew through the clearing, rattling the branches and rustling the dry brush. It was my cover. I used the noise of the wind to mask my movement and scrambled back deeper into the tree line, finally putting enough distance between us that the mics wouldn't pick up my breathing. I slumped against a tree, hidden in the dense undergrowth, and pulled my socks up. My feet were already getting cold. I had to get him out of there. I couldn't siege the cabin. He had the supplies. I had to force him out. I looked at the cabin again. I saw the thick black cable running from the back of the house to the small shed about 50 yards away. The generator shed. It was the heart of the cabin. It powered the lights, the heater, and the mixer he was using to track me. If I killed the power, I blinded him. No lights, no audio. But the shed was out in the open, halfway between the tree line and the house. To get to it, I would have to cross the kill zone, the open ground covered by the shotgun mics. I gripped the hatchet. I didn't have a choice. Darkness was my ally, but only if it was dark for both of us. I waited for the next gust of wind. The sky was darkening, the clouds bruising purple and black. A storm was coming. Good. The wind picked up again, a low roar in the canopy. I bolted. I ran low and fast, sprinting across the gap toward the shed. I didn't look at the window. I just prayed the wind was loud enough to mask the sound of my socks hitting the dirt. I reached the wooden wall of the shed and pressed myself flat against it, chest heaving, listening. Inside the cabin, the lights stayed on. He hadn't heard me, or if he had, he wasn't fast enough to react. I crept around to the door of the shed. It was secured with a simple latch, no lock. I lifted the latch. Squeak! The metal was rusty. The sound pierced the air like a shriek. I froze, looking at the kitchen window. The figure was no longer standing there. The headphones were on the table. The back door of the cabin flew open.
He was fast, much faster than a man living in a crawl space should have been. He burst out the back door, and for the first time I saw him clearly in the fading light. He was holding something long and metallic, a crowbar. His face was a mask of rage, teeth bared, eyes wide and frantic. He didn't look human. He looked like a cornered animal lashing out. He spotted me immediately. I was pinned against the shed, exposed. "You!" he screamed. The voice was the same raspy whisper I'd heard on the recording, but now projected with terrifying volume. "You ruined the silence!" He charged. He was maybe 30 yards away, closing the gap with long, loping strides. I didn't have time to be subtle. I threw the shed door open and scrambled inside. The small structure was dominated by the massive diesel generator chugging away, vibrating the floorboards. The noise was deafening in here, a constant rhythmic thud, thud, thud. I didn't know how to shut it down properly. I didn't look for a switch. I swung the hatchet. I brought the blade down hard onto the fuel line, a thick rubber hose feeding into the engine block. Spurt. Diesel fuel sprayed out over the hot engine casing. The generator sputtered. The rhythm faltered. Thud, thud, wheeze. Then, silence. The lights in the cabin behind me winked out instantly. The hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of the mixer, everything died. But I wasn't celebrating. I was trapped in a small wooden box with a dead engine, and a maniac with a crowbar was seconds away. I couldn't go out the door I came in. He'd be right there. I scanned the shed. There was a small ventilation hatch on the back wall near the roof, just big enough to crawl through.
I scrambled up the side of the generator, ignoring the heat radiating off the metal, and punched the hatch. It flew open, tumbling into the tall grass outside. I dove headfirst through the hole just as the shed door smashed open behind me. I hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt, absorbing the impact with my shoulder. I heard him roar in frustration from inside the shed, the sound of metal clanging against metal as he smashed the generator in a blind fury. I didn't wait. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not toward the woods. He was between me and the deep forest now, but toward the only place left, the cabin. It was a desperate, stupid move, but it was the only option. He was at the shed. The cabin was empty. If I could get inside and lock the doors, I could barricade myself until morning, or at least find a better weapon. I sprinted across the backyard, my socks slipping on the wet grass. I hit the back stairs and flew up them, bursting through the open back door. I slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt. I ran to the front door, still barricaded by the table. Good. I checked the side door. Locked. I was inside, but now the cabin was pitch black. The sun had fully set, and without the generator, the interior was a tomb. I stood in the center of the living room, trying to slow my breathing. My heart sounded like a drum in my ears. I needed light, but I couldn't use the flashlight. It would give away my position. Then I remembered. The fireplace. I fumbled my way to the mantel and found the box of long-stemmed matches. I struck one. The flare of sulfur was blinding for a second, then settled into a small, wavering orange glow. I looked around the room. It was a mess. He had torn the place apart. My clothes were scattered. My laptop was smashed on the floor. But it was the walls that made me freeze. While I was outside, he hadn't just been listening. He had been writing. Scrawled on the drywall in black marker over and over again were coordinates. 47.382 degrees north, 121.111 degrees west, 47.382 degrees north, 121.111 degrees west, and below them, in jagged letters, the 0 point. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't care. I just wanted to survive the night. I moved to the kitchen to grab a knife, something with more reach than the hatchet. As I passed the table where my mixer was dead and silent, my foot kicked something on the floor. I lowered the match. It was his acoustic map, the diagram of the house with the red circles. I picked it up. In the flickering light, I noticed something I had missed before. There was a new marking on it, drawn in fresh ink. A large red X over the master bedroom closet, and below it, a single word. Inside. My blood ran cold. The map wasn't just showing where he moved, it was showing where he kept things. Was there another way in? A tunnel? A hidden door? Crash! The sound of shattering glass came from the back of the house, the bedroom window. He wasn't trying the doors. He was coming through the window I hadn't barricaded because I thought I was safe. I blew out the match. Darkness swallowed me instantly. I heard the heavy crunch of boots on glass. He was inside the room. I was standing in the open living room. If I ran for the front door, the noise of moving the table would give me away. If I stayed here, he would find me. I gripped the hatchet, my palms slick with sweat. I backed into the corner of the room behind a heavy armchair and crouched down. I listened. Crunch, crunch. He was moving down the hallway. He wasn't rushing anymore. He was taking his time. He knew I was in here. He knew there was no power. He knew I was blind. But he wasn't. I heard a click, and a beam of light cut through the hallway darkness. He had a flashlight. The beam swept across the living room walls, illuminating the coordinates scrawled there. It moved over the smashed laptop. It swept over the couch. It was inching towards my corner. I tightened my grip on the hatchet. I had one swing, one chance. But then the light stopped. It fixed on something in the center of the room. The mixer. He walked over to the table. I saw his silhouette against the beam of the light. He wasn't looking for me. He was looking at his setup. He picked up the dead mixer and shook it, then slammed it down in frustration. "I can't hear you," he whispered. It was a complaint, a petulant, childish whine. "You made it quiet." He turned the flashlight directly towards the armchair. "You're breathing," he said.
The beam of the flashlight hit the fabric of the armchair, washing out the colors in a blinding white glare. I didn't wait for him to check behind it. I didn't wait for him to circle around. I knew that in a confined space, a crowbar had the reach, but a hatchet had the speed. I screamed, a primal, guttural roar intended to shock him, and shoved the heavy armchair forward with every ounce of strength I had. It caught him off guard. The chair slid across the hardwood floor and slammed into his shins. He stumbled back, the flashlight beam jerking wildly toward the ceiling, creating a strobe effect in the dusty room. "Get away from me!" I yelled, swinging the hatchet blindly into the space where I thought his head was. Thwack! The blade didn't hit bone. It bit deep into the wooden doorframe of the kitchen, sending a shockwave up my arm that nearly numbed my fingers. I yanked it free, splinters flying, just as the crowbar came whistling through the air where my shoulder had been a second before. It smashed into the wall, punching a hole through the drywall with terrifying ease. If that had hit me, it would have shattered my clavicle. I didn't try to fight him. I scrambled on my hands and knees, staying below the wildly swinging flashlight beam, and bolted into the hallway. I was running toward the back of the house, toward the master bedroom where he had entered. It was a gamble. The window was broken, meaning it was an exit, but it was also a choke point. If he caught me climbing out, I was dead. I burst into the bedroom and kicked the door shut behind me. It was a hollow-core interior door, flimsy. It wouldn't hold him for long. I fumbled for the lock, a simple privacy twist lock that could be popped with a paperclip, but it was all I had. Slam! His body hit the door from the other side. The wood cracked near the hinges. "I can hear your heart," he shrieked from the hallway. "It's too loud. Make it stop!" He began hammering on the door with the crowbar. Bang! 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 Each hit was rhythmic, precise. He wasn't just breaking it down. He was keeping a beat. I backed away, scanning the room frantically. The window was shattered, glass littering the floor. I could try to jump, but the drop was 6 feet onto uneven, rocky ground, and he would be on top of me before I could stand. Then my eyes landed on the closet. The double doors were shut. This was the spot marked with the red X on his map, the spot marked inside. Why? Why was this closet special? The door behind me splintered. The tip of the crowbar punched through the wood like a metal beak. I didn't have a choice. I ran to the closet and threw the doors open. It wasn't full of clothes. It wasn't full of junk. It was empty, save for one thing. The floor of the closet wasn't hardwood. It had been cut away. A jagged, square hole had been sawed into the floorboards, revealing a dark shaft dropping straight down into the earth. It wasn't the crawl space. This went deeper. A crude wooden ladder was nailed to the side of the earth wall, disappearing into the blackness below. The air rising from the hole was cold and smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like copper. Crack! The bedroom door gave way, the top hinge snapped, and the door hung crookedly, revealing the silhouette of the man in the hallway. The flashlight beam cut into the room, sweeping for me. I looked at the hole, then back at the killer. "Down!" I whispered. I jumped into the hole. My boots hit the ladder rungs, slipping on the damp wood. I scrambled down, sliding more than climbing, ignoring the splinters tearing at my hands. Above me, I heard him enter the room. His heavy boots crunched on the broken window glass. "Where did you go?" he cooed. "The floor is hollow." I dropped the last 5 feet, landing in soft, muddy dirt. I fell into a crouch, swinging the hatchet up, ready for him to jump down on top of me. I looked up. The square of light from the bedroom closet was high above, maybe 15 feet. He was standing at the edge of the hole, peering down. I saw the lens of the flashlight flare as he pointed it into the pit. I pressed myself against the dirt wall, out of the direct beam. "I see you," he whispered. His voice echoed in the shaft, amplified by the acoustics of the tunnel. He dropped a stone. It hit the mud inches from my foot. Then he did something I didn't expect. He didn't jump. He pulled the closet doors shut. The square of light vanished. I was plunged into total, absolute darkness. But it wasn't silent.
Now that I was down here, away from the wind and the trees, I could hear what was in the tunnel with me. To my left, deeper into the burrow, there was a sound. Beep, beep, beep. It was faint, rhythmic, and electronic. I fumbled for my pocket, praying I hadn't lost my lighter in the struggle. My fingers grazed the plastic. I flicked the flint. The flame sparked to life, a tiny island of yellow light in an ocean of black. I held it up. I was in a dugout tunnel, shored up with stolen lumber and old road signs. It stretched away from the house, heading deep into the hill. I followed the beeping sound. I walked about 20 paces, the air getting stale and thin. The tunnel opened up into a small earthen chamber, maybe 6 feet wide. In the center of the chamber, sitting on a wooden crate, was a setup that made my stomach turn. It was a ham radio, a massive military-grade transceiver wired to a chaotic array of car batteries. And next to it, pulsating with a steady green light, was a GPS tracker. The screen on the tracker showed a map. A digital line traced a path from the city up the mountain road and stopped right at the cabin. It was tracking me. I looked closer at the radio. Taped to the side was a photo. It wasn't a photo of me. It was a photo of the owner I had emailed to rent the cabin, the man who had told me there was no cell service, the man who had recommended this specific isolation. His face was crossed out with a red marker, and written underneath in that same jagged scrawl, "He listened too."
The flame of the lighter flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the dirt walls of the subterranean chamber. I stared at the photo of the cabin owner, the man I had trusted, the man whose property I thought I was renting. He wasn't just a landlord, he was a victim. This tunnel wasn't an escape route I had luckily found. It was a grave, and I was standing in the killer's trophy room. The beeping of the GPS tracker was the only sound in the suffocating silence. It was a rhythmic countdown, a reminder that my location was known, pinned, and watched. I looked at the ham radio. The frequency dial was set to 146.520 megahertz, the national calling frequency for amateur radio. But the microphone cable had been cut. The speaker wire was severed, just like the car, just like the generator. He didn't want me to talk. He only wanted to listen. I moved the lighter closer to the car batteries powering the rig. They were rigged in a parallel circuit, thick copper wires snaking out into the darkness of the tunnel beyond. He had power down here. Wait, if he had power, he had light. I followed the wires with my eyes. They ran along the ceiling of the tunnel, stapled into the support beams, leading further into the dark. I had a choice: stay here in the dark and wait for him to come down the ladder, or follow the wires and see where this rabbit hole led. I chose the wires. I crept forward, shielding the flame of the lighter with my cupped hand. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing colder and damper. The walls here were different, less dug earth, more rock. I was moving into a natural cave system that the tunnel had intersected. After about 50 yards, the tunnel widened again, and there in the center of a natural cavern was the source of the power. It was a workshop, but it looked more like a torture chamber for electronics. Dozens of microphones, shotguns, lavaliers, large diaphragm condensers hung from the ceiling like slaughtered livestock. Some were gutted, their diaphragms ripped out. Others were wired into a central mass of tangled cables on a workbench. And on the workbench sat a laptop. It was open. The screen was on. I approached it slowly, the blue light of the monitor washing over my face. It was running audio software. A spectrogram was scrolling across the screen in real time. It wasn't recording the room I was in. The input levels were too low, too steady. I looked at the input label on the screen. Room Master. I put on the headphones lying on the desk. They were grimy, the ear pads cracked. I heard breathing.
It was heavy, panicked breathing. I held my own breath. The sound in the headphones continued. It wasn't me. I listened closer. Beneath the breathing, I heard a faint creak, then a thud. The sound of wood hitting wood. Thud, thud, thud. Someone was hammering on a door. "Open the door!" The voice in the headphones made me jump. It was his voice, the killer. He was upstairs. He was hammering on the closet door. I realized with a jolt of horror what I was listening to. He had bugged the closet. He had put a microphone inside the tunnel shaft, near the top. He was listening to himself trying to break in? No. The perspective shifted. "I know you're down there," he screamed. He wasn't trying to break in. He was nailing the closet door shut. He wasn't coming down to get me. He was sealing me in. I ripped the headphones off and stared at the screen. The waveform spiked red as he hammered the final nails into the frame. He was burying me alive. I spun around, looking for an exit. The tunnel I had come from led back to the ladder, a dead end now that the trap door was nailed shut. The other end of the cave. I looked past the workbench. The cave narrowed into a fissure, a crack in the rock barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. But there was air moving through it. I could feel a draft, fresh, cold air. It had to lead out. I grabbed the hatchet from my belt loop. I didn't have a flashlight, and the lighter was getting too hot to hold. I looked at the workbench. There was a lantern, a heavy battery-operated camping lantern. I switched it on. The beam was strong. I squeezed into the fissure. The rock pressed against my chest and back, scraping my skin through my shirt. I had to turn my head sideways to fit. It was a claustrophobic nightmare. I pushed forward, inch by agonizing inch, the stone cold and slick against my cheek. I could hear the faint muffled sound of his boots stomping on the floorboards far above, behind me. He was probably dancing, celebrating. I pushed for what felt like an eternity. My panic was rising, a tight knot in my throat, telling me I was going to get stuck, that I would die wedged in this rock like a cork in a bottle. Then the pressure eased. The fissure widened. I stumbled out into a larger space. I swung the lantern around. It wasn't a cave. It was a basement. Concrete walls, a water heater, a stack of old paint cans. I wasn't in the wilderness anymore. I was under a structure. I found a set of wooden stairs leading up to a door. I climbed them, wincing at every creak. I reached the knob. It turned. I pushed the door open and stepped out into a kitchen. It was clean, modern, stainless steel appliances, a fruit bowl on the counter. I walked to the living room. Large windows looked out over a gravel driveway. Parked in the driveway was a pickup truck, a Ford F-150, and beyond it, I saw the cabin, my cabin. I was in a house across the ravine. I had crawled under the hill, through the cave system, and come up into the nearest neighbor's house, a house I hadn't even known existed because it was hidden by the dense forest and the ridge. The tunnel connected them. I looked around the room. It was too clean, too sterile. On the coffee table there was a stack of mail. I picked up an envelope. Mr. Silas Vane. The name meant nothing to me, but what was under the mail did. It was a receipt from an audio supply store. Item, Sennheiser MKH 416 times 2. Item, binaural dummy head. This wasn't a neighbor. This was his house. The cabin wasn't his home. It was his studio. The tunnel was his commute. And I was standing in his living room. I looked out the window again. Across the ravine, about a quarter-mile away, I could see the lights of my cabin. He had turned the generator back on. The windows were glowing. He was over there, thinking I was trapped in the hole. And his truck
with the keys sitting right there in the ignition bowl by the door, was 10 feet away. I grabbed the keys, but as my fingers closed around the cold metal fob, a sound came from the hallway behind me. Not a footstep, not a breath. Static. Ksh. A walkie-talkie sitting on the kitchen counter crackled to life. I can hear the keys jingle. His voice whispered.
I can hear the keys jingle. The voice on the walkie-talkie was tinny, distorted, but it carried that same sickening intimacy. He wasn't in the cabin anymore. He wasn't celebrating over my grave. He was here. He had baited me. The nailing of the door, the burying me alive, it was audio theater. He knew about the tunnel. Of course he did. He dug it. He knew I would crawl through the fissure. He knew I would come up in his house. He was guiding me. I dropped the keys. They hit the counter with a loud clatter. "Good," the voice whispered. "Now run." I didn't need to be told twice. I abandoned the truck keys. If he was watching, if he was listening, he was likely already outside near the vehicle, waiting to ambush me as I ran for the door. I spun around and bolted for the back of the house. I didn't know the layout, but I knew I needed to put walls between me and him. I sprinted down a hallway, checking doors. Bathroom, closet, bedroom. At the end of the hall, there was a heavy steel door. It looked out of place in the domestic interior. It looked like the door to a bank vault or a server room. I tried the handle. Locked. Kshh. Wrong door. The walkie-talkie on my belt. Wait, I didn't have a walkie-talkie. The sound was coming from the ceiling, intercom speakers. He had wired his own house with a PA system. "Try the basement again," the voice taunted. "It's cozy down there." I wasn't going back down there. I turned and ran into the master bedroom. I slammed the door and locked it. I shoved a dresser in front of it. I needed a weapon, a real one. I tore through the nightstand drawers. Bible, tissues, reading glasses. I checked under the bed. Nothing. I opened the closet, and I froze. The closet was lined with acoustic foam, floor to ceiling, wedges of gray charcoal foam designed to kill sound reflections. And in the center of the closet, mounted on a tripod at eye level, was a shotgun microphone pointing directly at the bed. And next to it, a screen. It was a live feed. The camera angle was high, wide. It showed a figure standing in a bedroom, staring into a closet. It was me. I was looking at myself, looking at the screen. But there was another screen next to it, a split view. The second camera showed the hallway outside the bedroom door. The hallway was empty. Wait, if he wasn't in the hallway, and he wasn't outside by the truck, I looked at the third screen. The label read, basement_stairs. The camera showed the door to the basement, the one I had just come through minutes ago. It was opening. Slowly, silently, the door creaked inward. A figure stepped out. He was wearing the gray coveralls. He was holding the crowbar. He hadn't been in the cabin. He hadn't been outside. He had been in the tunnel behind me. He had followed me through the fissure. He had waited in the dark while I explored his house, while I picked up the keys. He had let me think I had escaped just to close the net. I watched on the screen as he walked down the hallway. He stopped at the bedroom door. He didn't knock. He didn't hammer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. Of course, it was his house. I looked at the window. It was a second-story drop onto concrete. I didn't care. I grabbed the heavy bedside lamp, smashed it against the window pane. The alarm system, if there was one, didn't trigger. He probably disabled it so no one would come. I heard the key turn in the bedroom lock. The tumblers clicked. I climbed onto the sill. The wind howled outside, a storm finally breaking. Rain lashed against my face. The dresser I had shoved against the door scraped across the floor as he pushed it open. "Don't go," he said from the doorway. He didn't yell. He sounded sad. "We haven't recorded the scream yet." I jumped. I hit the wet concrete patio hard. I felt my ankle pop, a sharp, sickening snap that sent white-hot lightning up my leg. I screamed then. He got his recording. I rolled into the grass, gasping, rain mixing with the tears of pain in my eyes. I tried to stand, but my left leg collapsed under me. Broken, definitely broken. I looked up, and he was standing in the window, looking down at me. The light from the room backlit him, turning him into a faceless shadow. He raised his hand and pointed. Not at me. He pointed towards the woods, towards the tree line. "Run," he mouthed. I dragged myself up. I couldn't run. I could hobble. I limped towards the darkness of the forest. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't be near the house. I made it into the tree line, the canopy blocking some of the rain. It was pitch black. I stumbled over roots, crashing through ferns, making so much noise. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. I listened. I expected to hear him chasing me. I expected the crunch of boots. But I heard something worse. From the trees all around me, from the left, from the right, from behind, came a sound. Click, click, click. It was the sound of speakers engaging. He had wired the forest. And then his voice booming from every direction, surrounding me in the dark. Testing. 1, 2.
The forest wasn't a forest anymore. It was an amphitheater of nightmares. Testing. 1, 2. The voice boomed from the trees, shifting pitch and speed. It wasn't just his voice, it was a layered cacophony. Underneath the amplified narration, I heard the recording of my own screams from when I broke my leg. Snap, scream, snap, scream. He was looping the sound of my injury, blasting it back at me at concert-level volume. I covered my ears, dragging my useless left leg through the mud. The pain was blinding, a white-hot spike with every inch I moved, but the adrenaline was the only thing keeping me conscious. I realized what he was doing. He wasn't just taunting me. He was using the PA system to herd me. The sound was louder to my right, pushing me toward the left, deeper into a ravine, toward a dead end where the acoustics would likely be perfect for his final recording. I stopped. I looked at the dark shape of the trees. If I went left, I played his game. If I stayed here, he would come finish me. I had to go toward the sound. I had to go toward the speakers. I turned right, facing the blast of noise. It was counterintuitive, suicidal even. It meant crawling toward the pain. I pulled myself over a rotting log, gasping as my broken bone shifted. I saw the wire running up the trunk of a massive cedar. High up in the branches, a weatherproof loudspeaker was zip-tied to the limb. I kept crawling past it. The sound began to fade behind me. I was moving up the ridge, away from the ravine trap. Suddenly, the audio cut out. The silence that followed was more violent than the noise. The wind had died. The rain had stopped. Snap. A twig broke. Not over a speaker. Real. Close. He was right there. I froze, pressing my face into the wet earth. I was lying in a shallow drainage ditch, half covered by ferns. A beam of light cut through the darkness above me. It swept over the ferns, missing me by inches. I saw his boots. He was standing on the edge of the ditch, maybe 3 feet from my head. He was breathing hard. He wasn't whispering anymore. He was sniffing the air like a hound. "You're off script," he muttered. His voice was raw, angry. "Go to the ravine." He raised the crowbar, slapping it against his palm. Smack, smack. He took a step down into the ditch. My hand closed around a rock. It was fist-sized, heavy, and jagged. I didn't wait for him to see me. I didn't wait to be found. I rolled onto my back and hurled the rock into the darkness to my left, back toward the ravine, back toward where he wanted me to go. It hit a tree trunk with a loud thunk, then clattered through the brush. The killer froze. His head snapped toward the sound. "There you are," he whispered. He scrambled out of the ditch and sprinted toward the noise, vanishing into the blackness. I didn't breathe. I didn't move for 10 minutes. I waited until the sound of his crashing footsteps had faded completely. Then I crawled. I crawled until the skin was flayed from my elbows. I crawled until the sun began to bleed gray light through the canopy.
I didn't stand up until I felt the hard, compacted gravel of the old logging road under my hands. I lay there in the middle of the road, unable to move another inch. I stared at the sky, waiting for him to come back, waiting for the final blow. Instead, I felt a vibration. The gravel under my cheek began to tremble. A low rumble grew louder. Then the grinding of gears. A massive yellow logging truck rounded the bend. The air brakes hissed, a sound so beautiful I wept. I waved my arm weakly. The truck screeched to a halt. The driver, a big man in a flannel shirt, jumped out. He looked terrified at the sight of me, mud-caked, bleeding, broken. "Son, holy hell, son, are you all right?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed back toward the woods and whispered, "Don't go in there." The police raided the property 3 hours later. They found the tunnel. They found the nest under the cabin. They found the neighbor's house across the ravine, rigged with cameras and microphones. But they didn't find Silas Vane, or whatever his name really was. They found his truck, wiped clean. They found his hard drives drilled through and destroyed. But they did find one thing left intact. In the audio lab, on the main screen, there was a single file queued up. It was titled FinalExport.wav. The police played it for me later during the investigation. They needed me to identify the sounds. It started with the sound of wind, then my footsteps on the gravel from day one, then the sound of me sleeping, then the sound of my scream when I broke my leg. Snap, scream, snap, scream. He recorded many of them down in the ravine. That is when the rumors started about Silas Vane.